Welcome to the Successful Nonprofits Podcast. I'm your host, Dolph Goldenberg. In today's episode, friends, we are going to be having a conversation with Nate Wong about leadership transitions for nonprofit leaders of color. Leadership transitions are challenging, and there are additional hurdles and barriers that leaders of color face when transitioning into any leadership role, but especially the chief executive role. I recently read the article, 4 Ways Funders Can Support Leaders of Color, and thought, oh my gosh, I got to invite one of the co-authors to join us. And thankfully, Nate Wong said yes. Nate is a partner in the Bridgespan Group, a social impact consultancy based in Washington, D.C. As part of his work there, he focuses on equity-based power-shifting efforts that ensures that communities have the agency and the influence over decisions that affect them. He has worked with policymakers, nonprofit leaders, business executives, philanthropists, impact investors, and also, by the way, has worked in over 10 countries related to systemic transformation. I will share with you that in addition to being a consultant and a thought leader, Nate has also been in the trenches. So Nate has been a chief executive himself. Nate, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Dolph.
So, as I mentioned in the introduction, you were an executive director at one point. What was your experience like as a leader of color?
Yeah, I think at the executive position, there's so many exciting elements that can be had. You've been in that role as well, charting vision, building a team, creating impact. But as you also mentioned, it's incredibly challenging being a leader of color. And for me, I hold a lot of different identities. My Asianness, being a son of immigrant parents, I'm also gay. And so all of those intersectionalities kind of can come into play in a lot of ways in very positive aspects, giving new dimension and perspectives. But there's obviously some challenges that can go with it in a world that many would say has not been necessarily created with me in mind.
Mhm. And so what was your experience like your first year in an executive director role?
Yeah, it was quite honestly a little bit mixed. I think part of my experience was the visioning aspect of the role and being able to do things a little bit differently. I think one of the reasons that I was so attracted to leading a nonprofit was the builder aspect of it. And as you know, the beginning part of any leadership transition is the visioning and allowing people to see what is possible and what can, be done the same and what can be done different. So that I would say was, marked part of it. But the other part was actually a lot of navigating perceptions of what an executive should be and my own conceptions of what I thought my leadership would be. So, for example, I very much felt the weight of having to fundraise for an organization while trying to change course, navigating different dimensions of boards, some that were very much in line with the new vision, others that, were a little bit tentative about that. And then, dimensions with my own team members, some that were really excited because I could bring my fullness of my identity and maybe push for racial or other equity changes that the organization might not have had in the past. But there was a lot to balance in that.
Yeah, and I first I'm grateful. I'm genuinely grateful that you shared what your experience was. Thank you. And I absolutely understand that it was mixed. I know there were some terms in your article that I would love for us to have a conversation about. And so one of those is the glass cliff.
Yeah. So glass cliff actually is a term that is in reference to a phenomenon that I think was categorized actually for women. But essentially, I think many of us have heard of glass ceilings. Glass cliffs refer to the precarious and oftentimes risky circumstances that new executives find themselves entering into. Oftentimes, they're struggling or failing organizations and they're put into these positions and they're almost set up for failure. So that like notion of being on a cliff and it being this like, great, we made it. And then to look down and feel like, wow, everything is changing and moving and it's incredibly fragile. So just holding all of those aspects, I think is that image really reigns true. And from a lot of the folks that I've spoken to and my own experience, I think is very much a great way to categorize what it does feel like oftentimes being in these executive roles.
Yeah, it's such a good metaphor because, so often people spend years climbing their way up to the top of the mountain and they get there and they're like, oh, wait, it's a cliff. There's not it's not like, oh, there's a bridge over to the next mountain. Like there's just a cliff after this. And I know you talk about the fact that in the vast majority of circumstances, part of what precipitates the glass cliff is they're expected to fix problems that they did not create. And also, by the way, problems that didn't happen overnight. Problems that were emerging for years, but the board and constituents and staff look at the new leader and say, hey, can you get this fixed in 3 months?
Yeah. It's such a hard position because I think maybe to say two things on the glass cliffs metaphor, the ascent up to leadership is so different than when you assume it. And I think it is especially true for people that have, different identities that they're putting forward. And so for my own experience in that, for example, is I was probably part of much more white normative organizations. And so the ascent up was actually much more assimilation and how to understand the norms that, maybe I didn't agree with, but I kind of understood. And then when you get to these executive roles, there can be a notion of like, now I switch on to living the fullness of my identity, some of which that I've been consistent in living with and, putting out there, and other aspects of that identity I may not have felt the full support of. And so that is like that trickiness there. And so to your point about, how does it actually kind of land and how does it feel for executives, I think it can be especially hard for, the staff members of color. Like I felt a lot of weight for trying to make changes, especially around equity, because there are things that I totally agree with. And to your point, these are problems that are incredibly systemic. I wish I could wave my magic wand and have a lot of things change, but they take years to undo because they've taken decades and centuries to build. So even that like juxtaposition of expectations is one that is incredibly contentious, including for the leader themselves.
Yeah, yeah, and I hear you 100%. I mean, like you can say to staff, yes, I'm signed in on equity. Yes, I believe in pay equity, but your income is still your income. As you said, you can't wave a magic wand and suddenly have 30% more income unless you can convince funders to give that to you.
100%.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, I get it. I get it. You also talk about the double bind.
Yeah. So double bind is kind of the trap that many leaders fall into where they're kind of limited or constrained to a range of behaviors that are kind of quote unquote deemed acceptable for them. So, some of the leaders that we spoke to for the article said things like, I've gotten comments that I was, too direct. And then on the other hand, other people said I was not assertive enough. Like those feel like contradictory. So this like very knife edge like path that you have to walk is so exhausting. And I think for me, I received comments around, Nate, I don't think you have executive presence.
Mm,
What does that even mean,
yeah.
executive presence? What is that? And what does that connote for me being an Asian man who I can't tell if that's coded language for something, or is there actually something specific that I can work on? So just being able to navigate that, it takes, frankly, a lot of energy from the real work of being an executive, which is already challenging.
Yeah, yeah. And so when you received those comments about executive presence, did you ask more questions, or what did that conversation look like?
I mean, earlier in my career, I took those as statements that I would internalize. And I did not question those. I've learned a lot over the years to ask like the second
Yeah.
or third follow-up question. And it comes from places of curiosity. Like it's, I'm curious what you mean by executive, period, executive, and then executive presence. And those are two different things. Like one is that there's a monolithic view of what an executive should be like, which we know is not true. And then the notion of an executive needs to present in a certain way. Like, what specifically are actions that you're observing of me, and where can I correct that? But also, why? Like, what is the purpose of that? And so, just getting a little clear around what some of these comments are versus taking them at face value.
Yeah, yeah. Now, one of the things I was struck by, and it's in the title, and I reframed the title as I read the article. One of the things I was struck by, the title of your article is Four Ways Funders Can Support Leaders of Color. And as someone who's not on the funder side of the fence, which I've always been told is the promised land to be on that side of the fence. But as someone who's not on that side of the fence, I reframed it and I thought to myself, okay, these are four things nonprofits need to be asking of their funders.
Mm, yeah.
Like, how do I view this from an empowering standpoint of, okay, as a nonprofit, what should I be doing? Well, how should I be having these conversations with my funders as I have a new leader, and especially, if it's a new leader of color coming on. And so I'd love for us to talk about those four things that really nonprofits should be talking to their funders about. And one of them is, and I love the way you think about this. I often think of cash as a runway as well. So lengthening the funding runway.
Yeah, maybe before we jump into
Yeah.
some of the four elements, I might give a little bit of context around why we put funders in the front and center. I think for nonprofits, there's just such a scarcity mindset for very real reasons, right? And a lot of it is due to the limited funding that is out there. And so when we have spoken to a lot of leaders of color, there almost seems to be like, what can we do without like changing some of the real levers of the system, mainly funders and board members? It feels almost impossible to make traction here. And so, we kind of talked about some of the challenges of leadership. I see a ton of opportunities. And I think some of those main levers to pull are exactly what you mentioned. How can we engage funders differently? How can funders actually be driving some of this change? So it's not added weight and responsibility for the executive that we've already, talked about. It's challenging enough. And so just like that, it sounds minor, but the onus being placed on the system to correct,
Mhm.
not the individual organization or leader being important. And so I just want to like give a little bit of that context for like that intentional choice because it can be incredibly disempowering. And frankly, we're seeing a lot of stats that there is a ton of burnout. And so leaders of color who have been in these positions are actually leaving because it is untenable. And so
Yeah.
your question about, okay, what can leaders of colors do to, or any leaders, frankly, to engage their boards and their funders differently is absolutely right. And I do think it requires flexibility in grant making, where I know it's the holy grail, right, for everyone, unrestricted grants. But that really is something that, frankly, any organization will experience leadership changes. And if they haven't, it probably is not great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, change
Yeah.
is good.
If I could just jump in real quick, like, first of all, I appreciate you and your co-authors putting the onus and the burden on funders. I also feel like we as nonprofit leaders and nonprofits have this obligation to speak truth to power. And in this case, the funders are the power. I mean, let's face it, like whether your funder is the federal government or a state government or a big foundation, the funder or a major donor, the funder is the power. And so I feel a strong need for us to speak truth to power. And one of the ways where I'm honestly seeing this happening really effectively, and I know your article talks about this, like we're seeing mid-career professionals who would normally be in a place where they'd be ready to move into these senior leadership roles saying, no, I'm not willing to do it. And to me, that's speaking truth to power. And then part of that, though, is we have to continue to shift that upward to the funder and say, the reason we can't find enough leaders in the sector right now is because we don't have enough flexibility in our funding, and we don't have that runway. You as funders are not supporting us. You as funders are giving us $50,000 but expecting us to do $150,000 of work and then wondering why we're burned out and can't take it anymore.
100%. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. And the other thing I'll just say selfishly from the perspective of my friends who listen to the podcast, I know we have a few funders. We don't have a lot of funders who listen. Most of the people who listen to this podcast are nonprofit leaders. They're running nonprofits themselves. And that's also why I'll often say, okay, how do we frame this in a way that the people who are listening can really use it?
Absolutely. Our intention was to use this as a jumping off point for leaders to engage their funders. And we understand sometimes it's easier for, oh, Bridgespan came out with this new article. That's the entree
Mm-hmm.
for conversation versus, having that like really direct conversation without an entree there. So you're absolutely right. And we do hope this is coming from an empowered place.
Yeah. And I will share with you, I mean, that first one that you all mentioned, which is lengthening the funding runway. I do a lot of interims. At this point, I think I've done 8, maybe 9 interim executive director engagements. And it always pains me whenever I see an executive director coming into an organization without a strong runway. So maybe they've only got 3 or 5 months of cash in the bank, which, by the way, friends, I know some of you are listening going 3 to 5 months. I'd love that. That's actually not that much of a runway if what you want to do is big systemic change in your organization and take some big risks in the process. So I really liked the lengthening the funding runway and encouraging us talking to our funders and being clear about that.
Yeah. And you're right, Dolph, that this has to start years before an actual leadership transition. One of the things that was hard about writing this is so many of the aspects that we name, actually, when a leader comes in, it's almost too late to
Mm-hmm.
start to have these conversations. Board Source and Building Movement Project and many others have written a lot about that dynamic. The interesting thing, after we released this piece, we had some conversations with both funders and nonprofits, and they pushed us a bit on this point around lengthening the funding runway, in that oftentimes it's talked about as like pure unrestricted, like it is not earmarked. And one leader that we spoke with said, actually, I think it's important to signal that you actually have a pool of funding that is geared toward leadership
Mm-hmm.
transitions, and normalizing that versus seeing it as like a risk. A lot of other sectors don't see change in this way as a risk. They see it as a natural ebb and flow that actually strengthens an organization. So why shouldn't funders and why shouldn't the social sector think about it in the same way?
Yeah, absolutely. If we can talk about a couple more things we could ask of our funders as we're bringing new leaders on. One of them is building networks and platforms that really support leaders of color. Well, what does that look like?
A lot of it is actually developing a relationship with your funder and not taking it beyond just a transactional relationship. And so some of the leaders that we spoke with mentioned, look, it's great that a funder is giving us money, but the biggest intangible is actually lending their credibility, their bully pulpit, their name, and connecting us with other organizations, other funders, other partners. And that is how we advance the work. And so I do think it does require funders to take additional time and space and see it as part of their roles to connect with other donors, especially when there's so much pressure, fundraising pressure on leaders. Having that warm introduction just raises the profile of especially a newer leader that doesn't really have maybe the same, network or profile in the world.
Yeah. Nate, I'll share with you one of the things that I do as an interim to help set the next executive director up for success. And whenever a board chair asks me, Dolph, what could we as a board do to set our next ED up? This is always what I say. So in my final month to 6 weeks as the interim, I know who the next executive director is going to be. They've given notice, they're wrapping up their job, they're taking a couple weeks off, whatever. I reach out to the 80 to 90 key people that I've met as the interim. And I say, oh my gosh, we have this amazing new executive director starting. And I would love to get some time with you and the new executive director on the calendar now, sometime in the person's first 3 to 4 months. And typically, because one of the things as someone who has been a chief executive, I'm really cognizant of is 2 or 3 meetings a day is a lot. So, my goal is 1 or 2 of these meetings a day, no more than 5 to 7 in a week. But really, so that way after the first 4 months, they've met all of the key stakeholders who are going to be important. The piece that I often talk to boards about, though, I know you mentioned like the relationship has to be more than just transactional, more than just, may we have $500,000 and then, 11 months later, this is how we use your $500,000. May we have $600,000. We have to make sure that our leaders have the time and the space to actually nurture and cultivate these relationships. If we're giving them an impossible job to do. And I know your alignment on this. I see you shaking your head, right? But it's like,
Yep.
if we give a leader an impossible job to do, and then we expect them to cultivate relationships that aren't on fire,
Yep.
probably not going to happen.
And the interesting thing, this may sound like a tangent, but I've been reading this book, The Other Significant Other, and it really kind of plays around with this construct of, in a relationship, sometimes you can overemphasize your, you know, romantic partner as like having to provide everything for you. And it sounds strange to make this analogy here, but I sometimes feel like the incoming executive has to do everything. They're like superwoman, superman in this world. And I think fundraising is one of those elements that I would push, like perhaps that isn't really their primary job. Maybe the nature of how fundraising works gets shifted to, a business development team or a leader there, depending on what the assets of the leader of color are bringing. If they are bringing more program design because they're leveraging their lived experience to like innovate, that probably is a better use of their time. But I think it's like leader to leader, and it's like really forcing us out of these constructs that the executive has to hold all of these things at once.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's a good segue to one of the other pillars that we should be talking to our boards and our funders about, and that's that targeted fractional support. None of us is the perfect 360-degree leader. We all have weaknesses, whether that's finance or fundraising or HR or maybe programs. We all have weaknesses somewhere.
Yeah, and we did a little roundtable discussion before writing this, and fractional support was one of the major things that came up, especially if you're entering into an organization or even if you were a leader that ascended, into the executive from another role, you do need outside help just to make sense of like, is this true and objective? Because it's really hard to unearth like financials. Is that actually good or bad? It's hard to have a CFO conversation. There's incentive, like sometimes negative incentives to be truthful about where you stand on things. So being able to have outside support in like very tactical ways, and it doesn't need to be for indefinite. So it doesn't mean you need to create a new role for it, but having additional support, legal support is one where you have to make some tough calls about is the makeup of your team the right one for the new vision? And how do you navigate, exiting certain folks or changing roles? Like you do need outside support for that.
Yeah. And real quick, I just want to level set. I realized I said fractional support and you said it. If we can just briefly do a 411 on what fractional support is.
Sure. It's probably a newer term, but essentially are contracted types of roles where someone is acting in a very specific role that has a clear start and end date. So that can be in marketing, legal, operations, but they are usually part-time oriented, and can be incredibly helpful at the start.
Yeah. Nate, I'm glad you've joined us. I also want to make sure we have time to play what has become my new favorite game, Three Truths and a Lie. So I am hoping that you are
I am
going to.
game for it.
Awesome. Awesome. So please share 3 facts about yourself, one of which is not going to be truthful. And I will do my best to guess the one that is not truthful.
Okay. So number one, I have 75 plants in my house. It was a pandemic hobby. Number two, I'm a ceramicist and have been hand building for 5 years. Or number three, I am a picky eater and don't eat anything green.
Okay. I can see you being a ceramicist. And now it's a toss up between a picky eater or 75 plants. But I'll share with you 75 plants feels like such a precise number to me that I'm going to guess that that's the thing that is not actually true, that you don't have exactly 75 plants.
So I actually didn't do the count, but I think I do have 75
Okay.
plants. Maybe there's like one that's dying, so it's like 74 and a half, but
Okay.
um
Wow. Oh, wow.
I actually love eating and I do not discriminate in that way.
So I have a couple questions for you. So the plants, did you have any house plants before the pandemic?
I did not actually. It was,
Wow.
I discovered drainage holes. It sounds really ridiculous, but I think I overwatered and that's how I would kill plants. So that was a big discovery. And frankly, having plants and ceramics go hand in hand because I can make my own
Yeah.
pots, which reinforce it. These hobbies reinforce each other.
And so not a picky eater. So now I have to ask, what are some of your favorite dishes?
So hard. I like more adventurous things.
Mhm.
So I am always down for the latest new restaurant or like hole in the wall dive place in DC. So it's hard to answer. My go-to right now is a neighborhood place that's Cambodian, Taiwanese called Makedo. And that's probably my favorite right now.
We're going to link to them in the show notes. Nate, I'll share with you, I am also an adventurous eater. I have reached a point where I rarely order for myself in a restaurant. I just hand the menu back to the server and I say, just please bring me something amazing. And I eat everything but humans. Like literally, I've had insects, like I've had almost everything else. So just no humans. And I'm often amazed because I get things that I would probably not order for myself, but they're so good.
I love it. I love the trust that you have for your server wait staff. I think that says a lot. Maybe that's a new dimension to your, podcast, a little taste test
Yeah.
component.
Yeah. Ooh, I like that. I will share with you, I'm aware that servers actually have an economic incentive to bring me the most expensive thing on the menu. And it almost never happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, which,
That's when you know they like really care about the food. I
yeah,
always hate when servers are like, everything is great. That means you actually don't have an opinion or discerning aspect that is maybe it's helpful.
there's a restaurant my husband and I we go to a lot, and I do that every time, and we almost always have the same server. And after like 18 or 19 times, she actually said to me, I think I've brought you everything I can recommend on the menu. Can I just start over? And I'm like, sure, I'm good with that too. Like,
I love
please
it.
don't bring me anything bad. Well,
Or
Nate,
maybe they can cultivate a new dish for you.
that would be awesome.
Experimental.
That would be really awesome. Well, Nate, thank you so much for joining us. And of course, it's important to me that my friends who listen know different ways that they can interact with you. And so the first thing, friends, is I want to make sure that you go to bridgespan.org. It is an incredible website. Obviously, they're a nonprofit consultancy, but it is an incredible website with lots of resources, position papers, etc. So go to bridgespan.org and spend some time learning about what they do. Additionally, we're going to link to the article, Four Ways Funders Can Support Leaders of Color. Nate kind of, by the way, gave you a pro tip. A great idea. Send this article to some of your funders and say, oh, hey, I just came across this article and thought it would be really useful for you. And then additionally, on September 17th, Bridgespan is going to be hosting a webinar on this article. So we're going to put a link for how you can sign up in our show notes. And we'll also be linking to Nate's LinkedIn page. Hey, Nate, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun, Dolph.
All right, friends, if this is a conversation that you thought I needed to hear this conversation, this is an important one. And what's more, my funders need to hear it. There are two other episodes that I'd like for you to consider downloading and listening to. The first is episode 310, Navigating Nonprofit Leadership Transitions with Divya O'Connor. And the second is episode 334, Amplifying the Voices of BIPOC Leaders with Darren Isom. That, my friends, is our show for the week. I hope that you have gained some insight to help you and your nonprofit thrive. And each week, there's a lawyer who makes me say this. I don't want to, but I do it anyway. And honestly, it's just I'm tired of saying it. I'm not an accountant. I'm also not an attorney. And neither I nor the consulting practice provide tax, legal, or accounting advice. And you know what this means, friends. This means that this podcast is for informational purposes only. You should not rely on it for tax, legal, or accounting advice. And I say this all the time. Please don't get that kind of advice from a podcast. Don't get it from Google. And whatever you do, certainly don't get it from AI. If you need tax, legal, or accounting advice, find a professional, licensed person in your area who can give you specific advice for your situation.